Hello again. So I want to say hello to our virtual community. We have about 100, over 100 people virtually, so they can see you. So let's all say hello. Hi, everybody. That's great. It's exciting that, we all went through some challenging time, and technology has allowed us to connect to people that maybe we normally would not have, and I'm so grateful for that. So I just want to take one step back, and we can leave the slide as we are today. So today is full of connections, and we are going to have a panel discussion. We will have the KPMG team introduce the What Works toolkits. And then we'll have the Ideas Challenge activity. So I just wanted to get you prepared of what's in store for you today. I also wanted to acknowledge someone, and please forgive me, Juliana. Juliana Abdeji is also a member of the Ideas team. She's virtually in Kingston, Ontario, and she is our new admin tech person. And it's been such a joy to have her and to connect with her. And I didn't in person met her the other day. So our team is complete. Hi, Juliana. Broke the ice? Okay. So Wendy knows about diversity, as she talks about. Wendy is experienced, and she is going to share with you, she's done a lot of research. This is a topic that just from reading her bio, but in our communication online, she is so passionate about this. So we're honored to have her here, and we're going to learn from her, and I'm sure she's going to take some stuff back. So I want you to welcome Wendy. And next, our next speaker will be Anne. She will be virtually. And Anne is at the Educational and Leadership. She's an Indigenous speaker. She also does Indigenous coordination at the Queen's School of Business. And Anne is going to be talking about, from an Indigenous perspective, about how, is she there? Hi, Anne. And she's with the Smith School of Business at Queen's University. I had the pleasure of interviewing Anne for a TV show in Kingston, and she's just a wealth of knowledge, and you will definitely enjoy her conversation today. The next panelist is right here in the room, Kendall Ford, who's the Director and Project Manager of Egal Toronto. And we just chatted today, and we're both from the homeland of Irie, which is also known as Trinidad. So, so I learned something new. So he was going to have a pleasure of having a great conversation with us today. He's committed to social justice and does a lot of things around education with the LGBTQ communities. So thank you for being here today. And last but certainly not least is Claudia Desanti. She's a Senior Manager in Policy of Ontario Chamber of Commerce. And Claudia is going to wrap up the panel discussion from an Ontario perspective and just help us to bring it all together. So I'm so happy that all of you are here, and virtually Anne. So we're going to enjoy this conversation. So I'll invite the panelists to come up. So we'll have Wendy and Kendall and Claudia.
Great. Well, can you hear me? So it's really a pleasure to see so many people in person that I've only dealt with online. Welcome, everyone. Great to be here today. A number of my team from the Diversity Institute are here, Arif Cartarlo, Nancy Mitchell, and Erica Wright, who will be helping out, and I think Alison Campbell I saw around as well, who's on secondment from the federal government. So I will apologize in advance. I'm going to not be able to stay for the whole afternoon, but I will be well represented by my awesome team. I was asked to give a few opening remarks, and I thought I would just try to focus on a couple of things that have come out of the work of the Diversity Institute. So just by way of background, after the Montreal Massacre, and I'm going to talk about this because there are people in the room who are my vintage and will remember that as a sort of seminal moment in dealing with women's issues, whether it was issues related to violence against women, whether it was gun control, or whether it was women in technology and engineering. And shortly after that, the university, formerly known as Ryerson, decided that it was going to ensure that all first-year engineers had training in equity and diversity issues. So that was more than 30 years ago. And a lot of my initial work focused very much on gender and technology, women in leadership, women in politics, and so on. And the Diversity Institute did lots of research and published reports and so on. It was about 2006 that we did a big project with Catalyst that looked at the experience of middle managers in large corporations across Canada. And it was one of the first studies that looked not just at gender issues, but also at race and other dimensions of identity, because it was a huge study. It was, I think, 60,000 people responded, like a really, really big project. And that was the moment at which I understood that gender was really only one dimension of inequality that we had to address in Canada. Because what that study showed was that when you looked at the experience of middle managers, the differences between men and women in terms of their perceptions of fairness and opportunities and whether who you know is more important than what you know, there were differences for sure, and it really confirmed that women were disadvantaged, and we had lots of other data to show that. We knew about the wage gap, we knew about the underrepresentation of women in leadership roles, and so on. But the differences based on race were much bigger. So when you looked at the responses for white women versus racialized women, for example, they were much bigger than the differences between men and women overall. And it really was at that point in time, which is now about 15 years ago, I suppose, that we started to shift our focus at the Diversity Institute to look at more intersectional issues. And that is part of the reason I'm so excited about the potential of the 50-30 challenge, which you will hear more about. Because like Bill C-25, which requires reporting of, federally regulated, publicly traded corporations, it's really one of the first initiatives globally that addresses not just gender, but other dimensions of identity, including racialization, including persons with disabilities, including Indigenous peoples, and including those from the 2S LGBTQ+ community. So it really is, in my view, quite revolutionary. The work that we do at the Diversity Institute, we now have 130 full-time people, includes work that is research. We publish articles, we publish reports, and so on. We lead the Women Entrepreneurship Knowledge Hub. We're one of the groups that's trying to advance the 50-30 challenge, and we're also the research lead for the Future Skills Center. But the common theme that is really permeating our work is that the story Canadians tell themselves about how great we are is partly true, because we're pretty great, but we're not as great as we think we are. And for me, one of the big eye-openers was we led a project called the Black Experience Project with the Environics Institute. And I remember, as some of you will also remember, when Donovan Bailey said that racism was a problem in Canada and practically got his citizenship revoked because Canadians were so horrified at that prospect. But in the Black Experience Project, which interviewed almost 1,500 people in the GTA who identified as Black, half of them said they didn't think Canada was any better than the United States when it came to racism. And the final data point that for me was so important was work that we did with the Maitrey Foundation first in 2008, and we've done it sort of on an annual basis, where we look at representation in leadership roles across sectors, so the nonprofit sector, government, private sector, and so on. And it shows, as everyone knows, that women are underrepresented. So even though we're 51% of the population, we're about 25% of representatives on corporate boards. But in the city of Toronto, where for every white woman, there's a racialized woman, because racialized women are half the population in Toronto, white women outnumber racialized women on corporate boards by a factor of 12 to 1. So 1 to 1 in the population, 12 to 1 when it comes to representation on corporate boards. And all of these insights for us, which have come out of the research, are part of what makes the work that we do, in my mind, evidence-based, but also focused on driving change. Because we know that in spite of the stories we tell ourselves, we have lots of room for improvement. So I'm really looking forward to the conversation today, because I do think that the 50-30 challenge, which is it's a voluntary code, and I'm thrilled that Claudia is here, because the Ontario Chamber of Commerce is one of the newest signatories to the code. But it's important in terms of what it signals about organizations' commitments to gender parity and increased representation in leadership and on boards. And why is that important? Because leadership signals who belongs. Leadership has a big impact on the wage gap. The fact there are more men named Paul who are among the top earning CEOs than there are women is part of the reason why we see a wage gap. But leadership and representation in leadership also shapes the aspirations of other people who are diverse. If women don't see themselves, they tend not to aspire. If people who are Black don't see themselves, they tend not to believe that they can be whatever it is that they want to be. And so for me, the importance of the work around the 50-30 challenge goes far beyond the issues of representation, which we know is important, and really has a lot to do with our values and how we shape the aspirations of the next generation. So I really appreciate, I know there are many people around this room who have worked on gender issues for many, many years, and we can trade stories about what it was like when we entered the workplace. But what I'm really hoping is that by taking an intersectional lens and recognizing that not all women have the same opportunities, we can actually advance the agenda. So thank you very much for including me today.
I want to thank you, Wendy, for your comments, and to remind us that when we focus on equity, a lot of times we've come from thinking of equality, which is important, but it's really about equity. And within equity, we can look at intersections, because that's when we get true liberation, when we can look at the different experience from everyone. So our next speaker will be virtual, will be Anne Deere. So I'd like to, if we can welcome Anne.
Hi, everybody. If somebody could tell me when to stop talking, that'd be helpful, because I'll just take over the show.
Someone just told me to stop talking. Apologize.
So, So I go, hello, my name is Ann Deere. I have my Master's of Educational Leadership from St. Lawrence University in Canton, New York, and my undergrad degree was done at Trent University. I am of the Wolf clan from Akwesasne, and Akwesasne is a Mohawk community. So what I told you is how who I am as a professional woman, my educational background, who claims me as an Indigenous community, and who my family ties is from the beginning of time. So we can trace our family lineage through that clan to the beginning of time. For Queen's University, I work at Smith School of Business currently as Indigenous Recruitment and Initiatives Coordinator, but I worked there since 2016 at Queen's, and I worked with the School Faculty of Medicine, Faculty of Law, and Smith School of Business at one point at the same time doing this work. So I'm going to go through quickly and talk about some of the questions that we were asked to discuss here. Why do I do the work I do? I do the work I do because I didn't have a mentor. I didn't have a female mentor, and I definitely did not have an Indigenous mentor when I was going through academia. And so my academics took me on a very long road to success in my academic career. And what I do in my work, even though they call me Indigenous recruiter, I call myself a community builder. I like to build safe spaces within academia for Indigenous professionals. What my work has done is not only increased Indigenous population amongst students, but it also increased the job opportunities at Queen's for professional Indigenous people. My work has influenced creating 3 professional positions, one at Faculty of Medicine, one at Faculty of Law, and now at Smith School of Business. And through this work, we have managed to bring on 2 other very well, highly qualified professional Indigenous women from 2 other Mohawk communities. And I'm very proud of this because those spaces, those positions didn't exist when I came to Queen's in 2016. Some of the challenges I faced is when people want to be inclusive of Indigenous people, a lot of people who are not as aware or experienced at work Indigenous people want to put us in what we call a pan-Indigenized framework, and that doesn't work for people. That actually causes unsafe spaces for Indigenous people when you treat us as pan-Indigenous culture. It's important to recognize who you're working with, whose territory you're in, and what their experiences are, and understanding that even to this day, we are still struggling with historical trauma from colonialism and residential schools. And I want to thank the speaker ahead of me for bringing up the fact that in higher careers, such as boardrooms and CEOs and financial CEOs, we don't have the representation that we require for Indigenous people to achieve those successes at those higher levels. So we're still breaking ground. We're still very much in our infancy when it comes to breaking ground and making spaces in academia and some of those white collar careers. So my passion is helping Indigenous women and youth and our young men to know that they belong. They belong in academia. They belong in high profile careers. We belong in leadership positions because our people, we took pride in ourselves. We believed in our intelligence, and we believed in community. And one of the other biggest challenges is teaching people that poverty wasn't our way of life. We were always innovative, and we were always community minded. So those are some of the challenges I face. One of the other challenges I face in doing the work that I do in creating safe spaces for women, Indigenous women, LGBTQ+, or what we refer to as two-spirited in our community at times, to those who prefer it, is helping people to understand that we are here, we're not going nowhere, we haven't disappeared, and we need to have a voice at the table. My favorite saying is, we're not here to take your spot at the table, we're here to help you expand that table. And if you're gonna serve a prime rib, I want my prime rib at that table too. If everybody's vegetarian and we want to have the best there is, I want the same too. I want to be treated equally. And that, it's not about taking spaces, cutting people out. There's a lot of space at that table. Let's make room for all of us, and meet us where we are. What will make us equal at that table? We don't all have to be served the same thing. And the greatest message I want to send out to young women who don't see themselves in that leadership role because they don't have that mentor yet. There's a lot of us out there waiting to mentor you. I believe in mentoring people from a young age, even, and then I'll mentor people a little older than me who are breaking their way into this new career if they are needing it. But I believe in mentorship. Mentorship is one of the most powerful tools we have to make changes in society. And I also like to acknowledge a speaker before me for also speaking up and saying that white women are overrepresented compared to women of color. And for Indigenous women, it's even more so. And I always appreciate my allies, colleagues that I work with. But sometimes it needs to be a woman that looks like me or somebody else with a different skin color or a different representation that needs to speak for us at times. And I like to hold those people up. One of my goals when I go out recruiting is not only to find young people who want to start a career and be professional, but I'm looking for young people all the time who are looking to be leaders and are open to mentorship. Education is, Marie Sinclair probably said it the best. Education got us here. Education is going to get us out of here. And I believe that at the bottom of my heart. And I do everything I can when I'm working with young people to help them find their dreams in making those changes. I want to see more Indigenous people on Bay Street, on Wall Street, because even though they're more than an arm's length away from us at the grassroots level, their influence is so integral to our everyday well-being. They make decisions without knowing the impact it has on grassroots people. And if we have somebody who came from a grassroots network or community or family and makes it to that level of success, imagine how great this world would be if we had somebody up there that is not only looking out for the betterment of our country, but looking out for the betterment of the less than, those of us who will never be a 1%er. So amazing, because I didn't grow up in a 1%er community or family. I grew up in alcoholism, survivors of residential schools, poverty, poor education. My grandparents were illiterate, but according to society, they spoke a funny language, but they spoke the language of the land, the original language of the land. My people didn't think I spoke English as a first language when I went to university, because I learned my English from second language speakers. So when you look at where I come from, I had all the odds against me according to society, but I found my way, and I want to help others find their way as well. And that's what I do, and I give it all my passion when I do that. And I'm sorry I didn't give you guys some images to follow, but I got bit by a dog this week, so I was a little bit distracted. So I'm going to just share that too, because I like to come home and be in community a lot. And even as a professional, when I'm not in the school, and I go places. This morning before coming to this event, I went to get my booster, and the woman looked at me like she didn't think she even had to make eye contact with me to have communication. I am a very well-spoken woman, and I will speak kindly to people. And I couldn't believe that. The shoppers next to my own community would treat me that way. And I've never been treated that way in other communities. So even as a professional woman, outside of my professional office, I still face those. And we will always face them. It's going to take education. So sorry, I'm having a moment. It was just a little bit of a throw off before this interview. So, and the best thing I can tell you, because the biggest challenge I have in working with allies is doing the re-education. And so one of the things I developed for Smith School of Business to help the professors and students, and so that I don't have to repeat myself continuously, is I started to develop an in-house data knowledge bank, resource bank for the professors to use to find resources like me and other people. And the other thing before I go too much further, I like to say that when you're working for an Indigenous person, be considerate and know that we don't all have the answers. It takes many of us to build that community. It takes many teachers to share that knowledge. It takes many knowledge keepers to share that. It takes many elders and young people to build a community. So, and it's so understand that when, even though you have people like me in your workforce, we don't have all the knowledge. We share it, and it doesn't belong to us. It belongs to next generation. So everything I do is for the next 7 generations. So when my nephew, who's 8, and he's a Mohawk and half Black, when he gets to a place like Queens, I don't expect him to have the challenges I had. I hope that these people who are up and coming that say what they learned will really be there to greet him, to really be there, to make that space, to keep that commitment. For those little girls who feel like, for those missing and murdered Indigenous women who were made to feel like objects, that we make space for them to feel safe and become leaders and speakers. That's why I do what I do. I'm sorry.
No need to be sorry, Annie. So, Anna, I want to just honor that honest and heartfelt conversation from the heart. I know Anne, and we both live in the same city, and I know that Anne does the work because, as you heard, she's so passionate about it. And that experience that happened, we will take that, I know I will take that back, but we sometimes, like as Wendy says, we feel that we've come so far, but obviously with this event, we know we have so much work to do. And every day, women, men, people from the LGBT community, Indigenous people, experience that. And then they come into your workspace. So it's so important that we see people as human beings and have compassion. So Anne, I'm sending you, when I'm sending you a virtual hug, right? You're feeling it, right? Yes, I wish I was next to you. You were here, I knew you would get that hug. We're all sending it to you. And I have to thank you again. It takes a lot of courage, and Anne is an authentic leader, because when you can share that story and that experience and come here and be on a virtual stage and talk to an audience, that takes great compassion and passion. So thank you from the bottom of my heart and from everybody here.
Thank you. Thank you for giving me a moment. I didn't want to back out, but I had to share why I'm a little bit stressed in the moment, because I've been looking forward to this for a long time.
Well, thank you.
And
again.
those are the little things that come with us.
Yeah.
So thank you. Thank you, Liz. I see your heart. Thank you.
Okay. I think we just need to take a breath. So I'm going into my yoga teacher mode. So you breathe through, close your mouth and breathe through your nose. It really helps to calm down. And the reason why, when we breathe through our mouth, you're telling your body, I'm stressed, I'm stressed, I'm stressed, right? So when you close your mouth and you breathe through your nose, you're telling your body that you're safe, okay? And I also want to acknowledge, sometimes when we hear stories of trauma, it can re-trigger us. So at any time, I just want to remind, and even virtual audience as well, and in the room, please feel free to get up and take a break, okay? Because I know that when we hear people's experience, it can trigger our own or, re-traumatize us. So it's very important that we acknowledge that stories are not just stories, they're not fairy tales, they're stories and experience of real people. So on that note, I would like to bring Kendall to the panel.
Thank you.
Sorry, to there.
Thanks for that space, Ophelia, and helping us reset. Thanks, Anne, for sharing your stories and your work with such compassion. And Wendy, we've been on so many calls over Zoom over the last year, so it's great to be with you in person. I'm going to read from my notes, and I'm going to start with one of my favorite quotes. It's, do the best you can until you know better. Then when you know better, do better. Who recognizes it? Maya Angelou, right? Of course. So it's one of my favorites, and it's one that I reference often when talking about DEI work, especially some of the emerging promising practices. And so that's why I'm here today to talk about some of the findings that Egal has brought as part of our 50-30 challenge. So I'm just going to talk about 3 of them. So I'm a director at Egal Canada, which is a national charity working to improve the lives of 2S LGBTQI people and enhance the global response to 2S LGBTQI issues. Egal achieves this by informing public policy, inspiring cultural change, and promoting human rights and inclusion through research, education, awareness, and legal advocacy. As we think about the best practices for diversity, equity, and inclusion in the workplace, it's important to keep in mind the underlying principle that underscores these best practices, and that is the need for intention and the desire for openness and to organizational change at a systemic level. There is no band-aid, singular policy, or panacea that can make an organization more diverse, inclusive, and equitable. It's hard work from the very beginning and requires sustained efforts to maintain. We often get asked, where do we start? And like many other processes, is with the acknowledging that work needs to be done, and making a commitment to creating that systemic organizational change is the first step. I'm speeding, am I? Okay, I'll slow it down a little bit. First step to providing that solid foundation from which positive shifts in workplace cultures and attitudes can grow. So it's been suggested that to successfully create diverse, inclusive, and equitable work environments, there needs to be that significant shift in workplace culture, starting from recruitment practices, human resource management, and policies that prioritize people and seek to implement and maintain a safe work environment. Providing employees a sense of safety, belonging, and happiness in the workplace results in satisfied, productive, and healthy workers, which leads to increased employee retention, productivity, and can influence a company or organization public image. In short, diversity, equity, and inclusion should matter not only because it upholds social justice and human rights principles, but because research reveals it's good for business. Overall, the benefits of a workplace that champions DEI far outweighs any potential pitfalls and negative consequences that may arise. So, like I mentioned, I'm pleased to join the panel today representing Egal as a 50-30 Challenge ecosystem partner. And our collaborators recognize that this is continuing and evolving work. So in preparing our supports for 50-30, we started by reviewing literature and scanning existing promising practices. I'm going to share a few today. In creating these diverse, equitable, and inclusive workplaces, there needs to be a paradigm shift in how the organization is managed and operated, as well as philosophies on how success is defined and measured. That first best practice is recognizing the importance of representation when it comes to decision making. There must be a willingness to include employees, especially from equity-deserving groups, in decision-making, developing policies, practices, and guidelines within an organization, particularly with respect to diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives. When diversity, equity, and inclusion policies are being developed, many organizations fail to include the voices of underrepresented groups during the process, resulting in policies and practices that are devised from the perspective of those of the dominant groups, like white, settler, cis, heteronormative, ableist, neurotypical, etc. This, of course, has the consequence of overlooking any nuance or culturally specific issues that can be best understood by those with lived experience. Some possible solutions in implementing this best practice consider creating steering committees in the workplace focused on championing diversity, equity, and inclusion comprised from people at different levels of the organization, from entry level to C-suite, which includes those underrepresented groups. When developing policies, practices, guidelines, and so on, ensure that folks from underrepresented groups are consulted and their voices are heard, preferably from employees within the organization, and where that's not possible, including subject matter experts and credible consulting agencies. Intentionally seek willing members from diverse and underrepresented groups to be part of board of directors or equivalent leadership roles, whether it's in a workplace setting or part of labor union. It's been suggested that research that marginalized people feel discouraged to join in labor movements or workplace groups because they do not feel that their voice matters or that no people in leadership positions could properly represent them. Another point made by some research is that if employees felt a sense of belonging, they are more likely to have feelings of loyalty towards their workplace and are more likely to participate in voluntary activities because there is a sense of wanting to invest their time to help improve workplace conditions. Therefore, creating an inclusive, healthy, and healthy workplace is critical. A more novel idea for some organizations would be to consider a more flat organizational leadership model where there's no distinct organizational hierarchy or less middle management roles in an effort to have the value of employees' voice recognized. The next best practice is purposeful, intentional recruitment strategies that showcase commitment to DEI initiatives and progressive values. For this practice, the aspect of corporate or organizational image and reputation plays a significant role in attracting diverse candidates. Recruitment is a crucial first step to showcase commitments to DEI, whether it's explicit or subtle. During the recruitment phase, there is an opportunity for employers to make a significant impact in terms of developing a corporate or public image that is inclusive and progressive, which in turn attracts talent from underrepresented groups. One example, in one of the studies, several employers provided options for gender identity that went beyond the he, she, other categories and included alternative pronouns, for example, like ze or zer or they, on terms like gender denying, non-binary, gender diverse, etc. Feedback from non-binary and gender non-conforming employees mentioned that seeing these options in the employee equity statements made them feel more positively towards the organization they were applying to and were far more likely to apply to organizations that were intentional about adding these options because they were indicators of a queer-friendly, progressive workplace. I'm going to skip that and jump into the last practice, which I'll touch on, is moving beyond symbolic support to genuinely prioritize the happiness, health, and safety of all in the workplace. Organizations that work with subject matter experts to develop strategies aimed at systemic structural cultural change and improvement can go past surface-level performative supports. We've all seen the rainbow stickers and solidarity statements, but what more are you as an organization committed to outside of Black History or Pride Months? Consider things like prioritizing health in all forms, mental, physical, psychological, in benefits packages and so on, addressing workplace violence and safety. In today's society, in the wake of COVID-19, there's an increase of violence and hate towards racialized people and religious minorities. There is a high incidence of workplace bullying for 2S LGBTQ plus persons, especially our trans siblings. Despite DEI policies in place and zero tolerance for violence and harassment, it still persists. Education, of course, needs to go beyond the initial onboarding training, and continual employee development opportunities for continued learning, especially regarding DEI, needs to happen throughout the employment journey. Also cultivating a sense of inclusion and belonging. Employees that feel respected and valued by their employer results in that increased job satisfaction, retention, and feeling of loyalty towards the organization. All right, I would wrap up there and close off with Maya again. So Maya quotes, "My mission in life is not merely to survive, but to thrive, and to do so with some passion, some compassion, some humor, and some style." When employers can adopt that attitude, not just for ourselves, but for our staff, work becomes more than just a paycheck to cover the bills, but an integral part of a happy, healthy, productive, successful life.
Thank you so much, Kendall. And the one word when I was listening to Kendall speak was the word intentional. I heard Kendall say this over and over and over again. And I think that's very important because I can say that I'm going to do something, but having an intention means you have sat with the issue, the challenge, and the thought, and you say to yourself, I intend to do something. I have a purpose. Maybe you don't understand the issue or the problem in the grand master plan, but you are consciously deciding to do something. And as I heard your words, I thought, as a woman of color, when I see myself in an organization, I can feel more comfortable, and then I can be myself. Because for me, and I think for a lot of people, when you can be yourself and feel a little bit comfortable, then you can grow with that organization. But unless that organization is not intending to see that there are issues of racism and gender inequality, things are not going to change. So having an intention is the key, and being conscious about it. And I'm going to lean back to what Wendy said. Just because we see that there are problems within our country doesn't mean that the country is bad. It means that we say we love our country, and these are things we want to fix because we want to have an intention and create a world that we all want, with diversity and equity. So thank you very much. So our next panelist speaker is Claudia Desanti from the Ontario Chamber of Commerce.
Thank you so much. I do have a couple slides, I think. I can speak without them, but if they're up there, there we go. All right. Promise I'm not intentionally matching my slides, but just happened that way. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here today. I am Claudia Desanti, Senior Manager of Policy at the Ontario Chamber of Commerce, and my comments today will largely reflect the business perspective in my capacity at the OCC. Our membership consists of employers across a very wide range of sectors and regions of the province, and so from that vantage point, we understand how gender equity is really the foundation of a productive economy and a resilient economy. We also understand that there's a lot of variability in how gender equitable different employers and workplaces are. Some are much more ahead of others, and there are serious gaps that need to be addressed. I will say that gender equity and diversity and inclusion more broadly have been important to the Chamber Network for a long time, but it did frankly take the COVID-19 pandemic for us to move in a very proactive direction. The pandemic was a watershed moment for businesses in a lot of respects, and one of them was the impact that it had on women in the workplace. So thinking back to March 2020, when Ontario first declared a state of emergency, we saw quite immediately that women lost twice as many jobs as men in Ontario. And there are a few reasons reasons for that we won't spend too much time unpacking, but one of them is the fact that women are concentrated in particular sectors and they're vastly underrepresented in other sectors. So there's a very uneven distribution within the economy as a whole. They happen to be more impacted by lockdown measures, being disproportionately employed in things like restaurants and personal services. Another big reason that's worth mentioning is childcare. We know that women take on a disproportionate role of childcare within the household, and so a lot of them had to cut back on work hours or even drop out of the labor market because schools had closed for a time being. We also know that women entrepreneurs were more likely to close their doors and lay off staff during the pandemic. Big reason for that is that women-owned businesses tend to be smaller on average and less well-financed than those of men, and access to capital can be challenging at the best of times. So we noticed all of these impacts, and very important to mention, as Wendy and other speakers have noted, that there's an intersectionality component here, and all of these impacts were most severe for particular groups of women. So racialized, indigenous, lower income women, women with disabilities, transgender identifying women, all of the impacts are very much disproportionate among those groups. So having observed these things, the chamber and our members, we mobilized fairly quickly to produce a policy report and an advocacy campaign called the She Covery Project, which we published in September 2020. We partnered with Ontario Power Generation and the Women Entrepreneurship Knowledge Hub at the Diversity Institute, and Dr. Souquier was an instrumental part of getting that off the ground. The report itself contains over 40 policy recommendations, so we really tried to take a comprehensive look at the challenges. And I think one of the biggest successes for us in putting this together was bringing businesses to the table to have these conversations that maybe otherwise wouldn't have happened around things that can be contentious, like quotas and pay transparency legislation. So it was a step forward that might not have happened without the pandemic, because businesses were realizing the impact it was having to their workplaces and to their bottom lines. And this is one point that I think I'll make consistently in terms of the business case and the economic angle to gender equity. We talked a lot so far in the panel about the importance of representation and cultural change, and I think our experience is that when you can convince leadership that there is a business case for diversity, then you really start to see that culture shift. Internally, we also took a few steps, so we've signed on to the 50-30 challenge. Our board is currently 54% women and 38% racialized indigenous. Yes, and we have established a diversity and inclusion policy, which is also posted on our website. We also try to take a broader DEI lens to all of the work that we do, whether it's advocacy or programs or events. And something that we're working to do better is speaker representation on our panels. Frankly, it can be quite challenging on certain issues because the status quo circuit of speakers tend to be white male on some economic issues. So it's something we have to be intentional about. There's that word. So that's one of the things that we're working towards. I just wanted to go back briefly to the She Covery Project and some of the themes that continue to be important to us. So you'll see in the report, which is also on our website, that the recommendations fall within these 5 buckets. The first is leadership and accountability, and this is really about setting targets, making sure that women are represented at the decision-making table, and not just women as a whole, but that diverse groups of women are there, and establishing accountability mechanisms across different stakeholder groups. The second category, childcare, is really foundational to most of the other sectors as well, and making sure that the system is affordable, accessible, and high quality. We've seen some progress here, but challenges with implementation in terms of the federal childcare agreement, so a lot of more work needs to be done there. The third bucket is workforce development, and so this again speaks to the fact that women are underrepresented in particular high-paying sectors like engineering and technology and skilled trades, and so removing the barriers that they face all the way from childhood and elementary school up to mid-career training. Fourth category is entrepreneurship, and here we've again emphasized the business case for diverse entrepreneurship. There's a lot of economic value in having small businesses from different backgrounds and demographics, and so making sure that they have access to capital, digitization support, legal training, and a variety of other supports. And then the last category, last but not least, flexible work. So this is making sure that there are workplace accommodation policies, but critical here is to frame it as something that is important for the workforce as a whole and not just women, because it can backfire if it's seen as something that is, a special policy that's in place for a particular group. It can end up actually penalizing that group. So there's a balance that needs to be struck there. Since publishing the report, we were able to track a series of advocacy wins. So we've seen the federal and provincial governments make investments in entrepreneurship, in training for women and underrepresented groups. And the first one there is that historic Canada-Ontario childcare agreement that was signed in March of this year. Historic not just in size, which is $13 billion over 6 years from the federal government, but also in the approach, which invests in supply and will help improve the quality of the workforce. But as I mentioned, a lot of challenges in terms of getting that deal actually implemented. Looking ahead, we recognize that there's a lot more work that needs to be done. So we remain focused on working with our members to improve gender equity within their workplaces, in applying a gender diversity and inclusion lens to all of the work that the Chamber does and through our entire network. One thing that we're looking at doing over the next few months is establishing a diversity and inclusion council. So the Chamber has 5 permanent policy councils, and something that we'd like to do is establish a DEI one as well. If anyone's interested in working with us on this, we're still in the early days of mapping it out, and we'd love feedback on the direction that it can take. And on the advocacy front, we remain focused on things like childcare, particularly addressing the shortage of early childhood educators and attracting workers into that sector. On the reskilling front, providing training opportunities to underrepresented groups and making existing training programs more accessible to those groups. And then in terms of women entrepreneurs, we've really focused on supplier diversity in terms of procurement access and additional wraparound supports. So I'll stop there, and looking forward to the rest of the discussion today.
So we're going into the question and answer period. So our mic volunteers, if they can just come to the front right now, please. So within our virtual space, if you have any questions, you can put it in the chat, and they will come to me. And for our audience, if there are any questions, we have our volunteers here, and they will come to you. So I will watch the room. You can put up your hand, and I'll try to see your table number, or if you can just stand up, I think that will be easier. So are there any questions for the panelists?
Hi. It's on. Hello? Yes. Hi, I'm Maide Yazar. I'm a member of North Toronto Business and Professional Women, also the chair of advocacy for Ontario Business and Professional Women. Thank you very much for your presentation. Of course, we know this is a complex issue, but we also know there are solutions. So not only sharing the complexity and the subtleties, but we can work on solutions. So thank you. I have a question for Ontario Chamber of Commerce. You were a member of the Gender Economic Parity Steering Committee implementation of strategies. And one thing I did not see clearly in the 44 recommendations, which are powerful because, again, you recognize that it's a multidimensional, 3-dimensional issue to achieve gender economic parity. But what's the Ontario Chamber of Commerce position on the basic issue of pay equity?
That's a great question. Pay equity is something that we had done consultations around a few years ago before my time at the Chamber. And it's a conversation that we weren't able to have in full form before the publication of the report, to be completely honest. And we wanted to make sure that we did it justice. So it's something that we've continued to work on, and we're still in the process of developing that consensus within the membership. It's a thorny one. It shouldn't be, but it is for a few reasons. And employers are at different stages of that. So what we're trying to do is work within the membership to develop as much consensus as possible so that we can come out with a strong position. It's not off our radar. It's just something that we didn't include in the report because we hadn't reached that point at that publication date.
If you see other hands, I'm going to shut up. I feel strongly about this. All you have to do is ask Kendall. He told you equity is economic justice. It makes sense for business. Just saying.
I agree with you, and I think all businesses do agree in the principle of it. I think there's challenges in terms of the implementation because there's certain transparency requirements in terms of publishing the pay data. That is where the difficulty lies. I wish I could say more progress has been made, but we're working on it.
Thank you, Claudia. So any more questions in our audience? Some online, okay. I have one that's from online. It's for the general panel, so I'll read it. Actually, it's for Wendy.
Help. Erica, come answer the question.
So, but I'm going to pose it to the panel, and we'll see. So the question is, it's from Lise. How is the situation of handicapped women representational? Helping in marginal roles addressed.
Do you want me to start?
Yes, please.
Yeah, and I think Claudia may be able to talk about discoverability, for example. So persons with disabilities are clearly part of the designated groups that have been identified in multiple layers of legislation, and we actually have new federal legislation which imposes additional requirements. In our view, it's another dimension of intersectionality. Often it is one that doesn't get as much attention as perhaps it should. And, you know, when we talk about unpacking diversity within categories, whether we're talking about within Indigenous peoples, which has been raised, or racialized people, because we know the experience of people who are Black are very, very different than those who are South Asian, for example. With persons with disabilities, there's a huge range of experiences and social barriers. So there's a big, often when people say a person with disability, minds go to wheelchairs or crutches. I think one of the things that COVID has done has really highlighted, for example, issues around mental health. One of the things we've seen increasingly in recent years are issues around cognitive differences, which for many, many years were not discussed in this context, issues around addictions and so on. So I think one of the big challenges for persons, when we're dealing with persons with disabilities broadly, but specifically women with disabilities, is the issue of definition and the range. Again, one of the sort of positive aspects of COVID is that for many persons with disabilities, one of the biggest accommodations that has been important is flexible work at home, being able to juggle your personal needs with your the requirements of the office. And because COVID has accelerated new working arrangements, some people with disabilities actually are better off now than they were previously, but that isn't universal. And the final thing that I will say is some of the work that we've done, for example, with the Women Entrepreneurship Knowledge Hub, looking specifically at women with disabilities, is to really highlight certain kinds of differences as assets. right? There's an article in Forbes that's entitled ADHD, the Entrepreneur's Superpower. And so we know that often cognitive differences, while they can be disadvantages in certain contexts, can actually be superpowers in others. So that's another dimension of the issue that I think we have to look at.
Anyone else?
Just on the discoverability point, so the Chamber has a program through our programs department where we help connect employers with people with disabilities for job opportunities, and there's more information about that on our website, and happy to share that as well.
So I'm going to share a little bit of my experience because in my many former years, I worked with a lot of organizations as a job developer, helping people with disabilities find work. And the one thing that I want to leave you with is that it's about education, but it's also about allowing that person to tell you or seeing what they can do and not what they cannot do. And if you have to make accommodations for that person, you're also making accommodations and helping someone else who has a disability that you didn't know. So when you put the wheelchair ramp, then that's a classic example that we think of. It helps the person who has a sore ankle or who've broken their leg. So when we allow our companies to become more accessible, it becomes open for everyone. Any more questions in the room? No? What's about time? I think we have. I'm just going to check to see. This is a general question for the panelists. Just reading here. So what do you have to say about how corporations are advancing DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, not only in their workplace, but outside in society? So maybe if you have a story about how, when you work with other organizations, how are they advancing that? A success story, maybe it was a success story about working with a company who's really advanced into the diversity and equity.
Yeah, I think a lot of our clients are doing more decolonized policies. So kind of looking at figuring out how to not center property and profit and focus on people. And so thinking about looking at policies from a different lens that's more intersectional and focusing on health and wellness is, I think that's the trend that folks should be leaning towards.
Thank you.
Can I add something?
For sure.
So, we do a lot of corporate strategies because we're in the business school. And I think, back to a point Kendall made about performative diversity and inclusion, rainbow posters and general statements. I think in the last couple of years, expectations have increased quite dramatically. And one of the things we're really focused on is organizations putting their money where their mouth is. And one of the most powerful angles on that is actually procurement. And so we just did, for example, a project with Starbucks, and they have lots of great internal policies around hiring and support and training and all kinds of things. But our preoccupation was how much shelf space are they giving to diverse entrepreneurs? And the same thing is true with large retailers. So I think, as consumers, as investors, governments and others are increasingly asking that organizations show them the beef. Is that the right analogy? And actually demonstrate that they've gone beyond, rainbow posters and grandiose statements and are actually putting in place actions that make differences. And that's whether it's HR or their how they spend their money or who they send to events like this.
Thank you.
Investing in training too.
Right. We have a question? Oh, okay. Can we go back to Anne?
I just wanted to touch on that question a little bit. I think when smaller organizations see these bigger organizations making changes and making spaces for people who are LGBTQ, Indigenous, Black, Asian, people with accessibility issues, what it does is it signals to other communities, smaller communities, other organizations that this change is here. If the bigger leaders are doing it, it's time that we step up too. And what I feel is very important is when these corporations are working with people who are visibly considered minorities, diverse, we're doing our inclusion work. Well, I think one of the biggest important things is showing that we are recognizing and appreciating the people's time and knowledge, what it's taken to get those people to that point where we can come and speak. One of the things I always say to people, like when I come home, I'm building a women's lodge in my community for gathering and resurgence of cultural knowledge through the women. That I say to the women, oh, we're going to do this, and I'm going to find a way to pay you for your time. And they'll say, why would you do that? I said, because if I acknowledge that your value, I honor you. And I said, if people see me doing that, other people will do that as well. And so I think by corporations recognizing that their role as leaders, it helps to influence what goes on elsewhere, especially when they call on grassroots people to come and speak. There has to be that acknowledgement of the person and everything they're bringing and who they represent as a community. I hope I was on the right track there, but I just wanted to say that there's a responsibility on these bigger corporations to not only represent us, but to acknowledge us and value us.
Thank you so much, Anne. And at this point, we're going to wrap up the question and answer period, but I also just wanted to add and just sort of pull everything together. And back to my experience, when I was successful with one organization, let's just say a restaurant, a big restaurant, and I finally broke in to get my client in there who had a disability. And then I would use that to go to another big restaurant to say, well, I got them in at McDonald's, for example. And that's how it worked, because they didn't want to be the organization that was not working with people of diversity. So somebody has to be the leader, and we have all of us are in the room because we want to see change. I remember when I took on this role, the first thing why I was excited to be in this position was I believe that we all know what the problems are. In 2022, we know. And in my opinion, if we don't know, then maybe you don't want to know. But that's just my opinion. But what I really was passionate about this project is that we were talking about solutions. Because there are solutions, and sometimes we don't know, but it's all about let's highlight those solutions and repeat them again and again, and that's how we're going to bring about change. Okay, so I wanted to thank our panelists.